Hello, my name's Tim Collins. This is my final project for Young Adult Literature, English 461 at Buffalo State College. I'm going to be talking about a couple of young adult novels that I read. And here are the novels. The first is The Tombs of Atuan, published in 1970 by Ursula Le Guin, who's a famous science fiction writer. This book actually is a part of a larger series called Earth-Sea, which has been very popular. It was made into an anime movie, and there's also a miniseries on the Sci-Fi Network. The second book is Legend by Marie Lu, published in 2011. It's a science fiction, dystopian science fiction for young adults. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I believe it will be made into a movie sometime in the next few years. I made a trailer of The Tombs of Atuan. The music in the background is by the artist by the name of Frog Pocket, and it's from the record Moon Mountains of the Ford. Just to cite that, I'm going to play the video. What have they ever given to you, Tanar? Nothing, she whispered. They have nothing to give. They have no power of making. All their power is to darken and destroy. They cannot leave this place. They are this place, and it should be left to them. They should not be denied or forgotten, but neither should they be worshipped. The earth is beautiful and bright and kindly, but that is not all. The earth is also terrible and dark and cruel. The rabbit shrieks dying in the green meadows. The mountains clench their great hands full of hidden fire. There are sharks in the sea, and there is cruelty in men's eyes. And where men worship these things and abase themselves before them, they are evil breeds. These places are made in the world where darkness gathers, places given over wholly to the ones whom we call nameless, the ancient and holy powers of the earth before the light, powers of the dark, of ruin, of madness. I think they drove your priestess Casa mad a long time ago. I think she has prowled these caverns as she prowls the labyrinth of her own self, and now she cannot see the daylight anymore. She tells you that the nameless ones are dead. Only a lost soul, lost to truth, can believe that. They exist, but they are not your masters. They never were. You are free, Tanar. You were taught to be a slave, but you have broken free. She listened, though her expression did not change. He said no more. They were silent, but it was not the silence that had been in that room before she entered. It was the breathing of the two of them now, and the movement of life in their veins, and the burning of the candle in its lantern of tin, a tiny, lively sound. How is it that you know my name? He walked up and down the room, stirring up the fine dust, stretching his arms and shoulders in an effort to shake off the numbing chill. Knowing names is my job, my art. To weave the magic of a thing, you see, you must find its true name out. In my lands, we keep our true names hidden all our lives long, from all but those whom we trust utterly. For there is great power and great peril So as you can probably tell, there's a lot of young adult themes, growing up, finding your identity, all that type of thing. But I'm going to talk a second about Ursula Le Guin. She's a very highly respected writer of science fiction and fantasy. It's one of the reasons why I chose to read this novel, because I knew it would be very well written and it'd be a good thing to turn young adults onto. She's the author of a few classics. You can at least call The Left Hand of Darkness a classic and The Dispossessed a classic. And these are big books written for adults. The only thing she wrote for young adults was this Earth-Sea series. And she's won many awards in her career, mostly the science fiction and fantasy Hugo and Nebula awards. but she was just recently um, honored by the Library of Congress and the American Library Association. So I'm going to play her acceptance speech because I think she says a lot of really great things about fantasy and the value of fantasy literature.
Thank you, Neil. And to the givers of this beautiful reward, my thanks from the heart. My family, my agents, my editors, know that my being here is their doing as well as mine, and that the beautiful reward is theirs as much as mine. And I rejoice in accepting it for and sharing it with all the writers who were excluded from literature for so long, my fellow authors of fantasy and science fiction, writers of the imagination, who for the last 50 years watched the beautiful rewards go to the so-called realists. I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now and can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine some real grounds for hope. We will need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, the realists of a larger reality. Right now, I think we need writers who know the difference between production of a market commodity and the practice of an art. Developing written material to suit sales strategies in order to maximize corporate profit and advertising revenue is not quite the same thing as responsible book publishing or authorship. Thank you, brave applauders. Yet, I see sales departments given control over editorial. I see my own publishers in a silly panic of ignorance and greed charging public libraries for an e-book 6 or 7 times more than they charge customers. We just saw a profiteer try to punish a publisher for disobedience, and writers threatened by corporate fatwa. And I see a lot of us, the producers, who write the books and make the books, accepting this, letting commodity profiteers sell us like deodorant and tell us what to publish and what to write. Well, I love you too, darling. Books, you know, they're not just commodities. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. I have had a long career and a good one, in good company. Now, here at the end of it, I really don't want to watch American literature get sold down the river. We who live by writing and publishing want and should demand our fair share of the proceeds. But the name of our beautiful reward is not profit. Its name is freedom. Thank you.
So, Le Guin touched on a lot of elements of fantasy. I'm just going to go through a very brief overview. It's a huge presence in popular culture today with, kids' books like Harry Potter, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Game of Thrones, which is very popular amongst adults, Twilight could be considered fantasy. It's very popular among adolescents. As I said earlier, fantasy and sci-fi have generally been associated with children's literature, but as Le Guin made the point there, there's a lot more to the genres, and we're seeing a lot of that today. And I guess just as a simple definition, you could say fantasy generally depicts a world which is radically different from our own, but in such a way that it is believable. And the beginnings of fantasy literature are in ancient mythology, and where we could say modern fantasy begins is kind of difficult to say. So where does it come from? As I said, mythology and folklore. It's difficult to say when modern fantasy began. Some people have argued that it was Shakespeare with A Midsummer Night's Dream, Midsummer's Night Dream, Edmund Spenser, the Arthurian romances. Some of the early novelists who were working in the genre include Walter Scott, George MacDonald, William Morris, and John Ruskin. That was early 19th century, around that time in England and Scotland. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Tombs of Atuan is good for teaching. So in Le Guin's talk, in her acceptance speech, she made some really great points about fantasy, which are why I think it's such a great thing to teach. My first bullet point up there is critical thinking, a radically different worldview, and that's exactly what you talked about, that fantasy allows us a medium by which to imagine a world that's completely, radically different from the world we live in. Le Guin had some political sentiments to add to that, but I think just in terms of critical thinking, generally speaking, if we read a novel where there's a world that's very much different from our own, and we realize that that world is constructed in such and such a way, and yet it's believable, that can help us question the way our own world is constructed in such a way, and that we do believe it, and that maybe we should question some of the assumptions that we take for granted. So I just think, generally speaking, fantasy, if it's written well, can be so good for that reason. The problem is a lot of the commodified fantasy out there kind of gives the genre a bad name. It's known for being escapist and kind of shallow. You just have basically a bunch of wizards and dragons and magic and all that, and there's not really any depth to it. But a book like this, and the whole Earth-Sea cycle, Le Guin constructs this world, and it's just, it's beautiful, and it's really awe-inspiring, because she creates this world which is so radically different from our own, but it's so believable, and you get so uh, invested in it. It's really a remarkable thing. And even in this novel, one of the plot, uh, one of the threads of the plot is just the idea that this girl, Tanar, is grown up to believe in a certain way. She identifies herself because of the way she was told to think of herself. She believes the world around her is a certain way because she was told that it was a certain way. Then some stranger comes on the scene and kind of gives her a whole new perspective. And so it kind of dramatizes the whole experience of being taught to believe in something and then coming of age, as it were, and questioning those things that you were taught to take for granted. So it really does, even more than just the fantasy genre, this book takes up that issue. And on the bottom there, in the last bullet point, under the themes, I have developing identity versus ideology, and I think that that goes hand in hand with the critical thinking. My second bullet point up here, though, is another important one. I say Bildungsroman with the female protagonist. One of the things about young adult lit that's very interesting is they're basically all of them would fit under the category of Bildungsroman, which is a story about a young person coming of age and getting their education in the world. Some of the other themes that I thought were very important, as I said, as I kind of alluded to, there's empathy between cultures, genders, and races. The first book in this Earth Sea series is based on the protagonist Sparrowhawk, or Ged, who's a male. And now the second installation is based on Tanar, who is a female. So you get these two radically different perspectives coming together, and they actually kind of sort of get along. And also cultures. Ged comes from the inner lands, and Tanar comes from kind of the outer territories. And given the world that they live in, it's a very primitive world, but there's not a lot of transportation. So the cultures they come from are like radically different. And also, Ged is brown skin, Tanar is very pale white skin, so they come from different races. And the whole idea is that these two characters coming together, they have empathy for one another, and they kind of respect one another's differences rather than hating each other. And probably my favorite theme of the novel is that of hospitality. I don't want to go too much into the plot, but Tanar had a chance to kill Ged, and it was actually her duty to kill him, but kind of in spite of herself, she didn't. She actually, for no real reason, was offered him hospitality. And I really think that's a theme throughout. I'm just going to read one short passage where it becomes very obvious. It's at the end of the book. There's a whole plot element that takes this idea of hospitality even further, but anyway, page 194 of my edition, it says, after a pause, she said, I see your magic is not good only for large things. Hospitality, he said, kindness to a stranger, that's a very large thing. Thanks are enough, of course, but I was sorry for the goats. I'm not going to get into the plot about what happened there, but that idea of hospitality is a great theme throughout the book. Their whole kind of mission in the novel centers around something that has to do, I won't give it away, And I put this site up here, further reading. There's a great critical reader called Fantastic Literature, critical reader edited by David Sandner. If you're interested in fantasy at all, this is like such a great collection. It's got formative essays by famous literary people such as Anna Letitia Barbeau, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Anne Radcliffe, Charles Dickens, Sigmund Freud, and then contemporary critical essays by Ursula Le Guin herself, Harold Bloom, huge, American deconstructionist at Yale, Fred Jameson, the most famous American Marxist in the world, Mikhail Bakhtin, Northrop Frye, China Mieville, Savan Todorov, a famous Russian formalist. So the reason why I put this site up here is just to show that no matter what reputation fantasy might have, and no matter how one-dimensional Harry Potter might be, fantasy really can be a great medium to do some good thinking in. And all these essays are kind of exemplify that. A big trend is fantasy and Marxism. That's why Fred Jameson and China Mieville are in this collection. But the better fantasy is really a great segue into things like politics and philosophy. I think that novels like this can be, used at the college level to talk about some pretty heavy-duty critical ideas. So they're definitely fit for a secondary classroom. And I think, just in closing, that if there are any students who already have an interest in any of these fantasy literatures, I think it's a great thing for teachers because you can try to turn them on to something which is similar, but maybe a little bit more substantial, and they can maybe transition into reading something a bit more challenging. And that also goes for some of the ancient mythology. Like, for example, the Tombs of Atuan is set in this kind of primitive world. It would be pretty simple to make a transition between that and, say, the Odyssey or Beowulf, or even the Epic of Gilgamesh or something. So there are tons of ways in which fantasy, generally speaking, I think can be really good for young adults, and it's very popular. And I'd say that the Earthsea series by Ursula Le Guin is maybe the best series of fantasy novels that you can hope to come across. So they're very highly recommended. Just to make a transition, I want to compare these two novels, their genres, and why they're both good for critical thinking. And in the process, kind of really quickly talk about what the difference between fantasy and science fiction is. So the Tombs of Atuan would fall under the category of fantasy. In both fantasy and science fiction, what kind of defines the genre is there's an extrapolation. In other words, kind of the use of imagination to think of a world that's different from our own. In fantasy, it's generally going backwards in time to some point before recorded history. So before recorded history, kind of anything is sort of possible because we don't have records. So there could be, wizards and dragons and magic and all that stuff. it's the part of the reason why it's believable is because it's before recorded history, and so there's kind of a kind of blank slate. Science fiction is usually the opposite. Um, Legend would fall under the category of science fiction. The extrapolation is forward in time. In other words, some point in the future, usually at least 100 years. If we think about how certain we can be what's going to happen in the future, we can be pretty certain what's going to kind of happen tomorrow because it's going to be very similar to what's going on today. But 100 years from now, 200 years from now, or more, it's like a blank slate. Anything is really possible. So it's a good medium for writers to kind of think of a completely different culture. And the other thing about science fiction, especially the dystopian science fictions, is that it's not just a radically different culture, but it's a culture which is kind of a logical extension of our own culture. And so it's a way by which to critique elements of our own culture that maybe we should be a little bit skeptical about. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of basic information about the book here. It's Marie Lu's first novel, Legend. There was actually a review in the New York Times that kind of said that the book defied expectations, because usually when you have this commercialized kind of novel that is an author's first novel, it usually kind of falls pretty flat, but that's not the case with Legend, and I would agree with that. I think it's a pretty well-written novel. I'm going to get into some of the deeper issues it talks about. I think it's a really kind of complex, layered dystopian fiction. Another interesting aspect of it is that it's kind of meant to be a contemporary adaptation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, which is specifically written for young adults. They're kind of two protagonists, one young man, one young woman, and they're both kind of in their teenage years, 15, 16 years old. But what's interesting to me is that in the same way that Hugo's novel is very critical of society in certain ways, as the title kind of gives away, Legend, I would argue, also critiques society in a very similar way. Now, the difference is obviously that he uses dystopian science fiction as a way to do that, where Hugo's novel was a realist novel. But I would say that, I would argue that the novel is parallel with Les Miserables in the way in which it's very critical of society. I just have a quote down here from Hugo to kind of give a sense of how that novel is critical of society. So long as there shall exist, by reason of law and custom, a social condemnation which, in the face of civilization, artificially creates hells on earth, so long as ignorance and misery remain on earth, books like this cannot be useless. That's it. A lot of what goes on in the world that Lou creates in Legend could kind of be described as hell on earth. And it's portrayed not just as like some post-apocalyptic wasteland, but a artificially created society with a certain ideology which is very harsh. So I would say that there are a lot of parallels between Hugo and Lou, and it's very consciously an adaptation. I have a little trailer I made on the book, so I'm just going to play this. I'm the first one to speak. You and I may have the same enemy, I say. and they've pitted us against each other. June takes a deep breath. I'm not sure yet, she says, even though I can tell by her voice that she agrees with me. It's dangerous for us to talk like this. She looks away, reaches into her cloak, and pulls out something I thought I had lost at the hospital. Here, I want to give this back to you. I have no more use for it. You had it, I whisper. You found it at the hospital that night, didn't you? That's how you recognized me when you finally found me. I must have reached for it. June nods quietly, then takes my hand and drops the pendant into my palm. I look at it and wonder. My father, I can't keep the memory of him away now that I'm staring at my pendant again. I think back to the day he visited us after 6 months without a word. When he was safely inside and we draped curtains over the windows, he wrapped his arms around Mom and kissed her for such a long time. He kept one hand pressed protectively on her stomach. John waited patiently to greet him, hands in his pockets. I was still young enough to hug his leg. Eden wasn't born yet. He was still inside Mom's growing belly. How are my boys? My father said, after we finally let go of Mom. He patted my cheek and smiled at John. Then he looked at me. I remember studying his face. Dad's official job in the Republic was to clean up after the war front soldiers, of course. But there were always hints that this wasn't the only job he had. Hints like the stories he sometimes told about the colonies and their glittering cities, their advanced technology and festive holidays. At that moment, I wanted to ask him why he was always gone after his war front rotation should have returned him home, why he never came to see us. But something else distracted me. There's something in your vest pocket, Dad, I said. Sure enough, a circular bump was pressed against the cloth. He chuckled, then took out the object. So there is, Daniel. He glanced up at our mother. He's very perceptive, isn't he? Mom smiled at me. My father hesitated, then ushered us all into the bedroom. Grace, he said to Mom, look what I found. She studied it closely. What is it? It's more proof. At first my father tried to show it only to Mom, but I managed to get a good look as he turned it over in his hands. A bird on one side, a man's profile on the other. United States of America, in God we trust. $250 embossed on one side, and Liberty in 1990 on the other. See? Evidence. He pressed it into her palm. Where did you find this? Mom asked. In the southern swamplands between the two war fronts. It's a genuine coin from 1990. See the name? United States. It was real. My mother's eyes gleamed with excitement, but she still gave Dad a grave look. This is a dangerous thing to own, she whispered. We're not keeping this in our house. So the music there was courtesy of the group Arpanet from Detroit, and actually in my montage of images there, one of those images of the dystopian future was actually an image of contemporary day Detroit. So a little connection there. There are plenty of other trailers on YouTube. I'm gonna skip the one because I'm running short on time, but I just want to talk a little bit about ways that this novel can be used to teach. I talked about critical thinking. I'll get into that a little bit more, but another topic one could use this novel to teach, or any of the dystopian teen fiction novels, really, is rhetorical analysis and hyperbole. Dystopian science fiction usually exaggerates aspects of contemporary society for the sake of critiquing, or at least thinking critically about contemporary culture. So, this can be a lesson on rhetorical analysis and hyperbole, which, just to give the quickest possible definition, is the use of exaggeration as a figure of speech or rhetorical device. The great thing about hyperbole is it could either be a literary device or it could be just rhetoric. As in the Common Core Regents exam, one of the essays is, argumentation. So this could work in a unit that's trying to take care of that side of the Common Core. And another rhetorical device I want to talk about it quickly is reductio ad absurdum. which basically is following the logic of an argument to an absurd conclusion. For example, if there's no such thing as gravity, then people can fly. I think that this is put in place by the dystopian teen fiction, which really has some substance to it, because you're essentially, like all dystopian fiction, you're looking at contemporary society and saying, okay, this is what our society is today. This is the direction it's going, and we're not making any meaningful effort to change that. So if it is this way, then we can expect it to be that way in the future. And that's kind of just the basic modus operandi of dystopian fiction, and that's definitely a play in Lou's novel. And just to give a quick rundown of some of the ways in which Lou is critiquing contemporary society in her dystopia, I have a list here. The first is an extreme inequality. There's a privileged class and an underclass. Unfortunately, in the world today, things are becoming more and more like this. It's very extreme in the novel. I mean, I'd hate to be an alarmist. The way it's portrayed in the novel is obviously much worse than it is, at least in the United States. But there are other places in the world where the disparity between the privileged and everybody else is really terrible. So the novel might not be that far off, unfortunately. Second point is there's a sham democracy with corrupted elections where everything is kind of decided beforehand, and the elections aren't meaningful. I think today with campaign finance issues that seem never to be resolved, this is a very big problem for us, and the way the democracy works in the novel is definitely a critique of the way we practice democracy today. Third point, militarized police using deadly force against citizens, with all the protests going on today with Michael Brown and Eric Garner, just to name a couple of the dozens of shootings of African American men by police. It goes without saying that this is definitely maybe the biggest issue going on in the U.S. today. Fourth, environmental catastrophes. The novel is post-apocalyptic, and that L.A. it takes place in Los Angeles, and L.A. has become like basically a flooded city where there's like buildings that are half submerged in water. It's like a giant lake. So, I mean, again, it goes without saying, but this is kind of like the reductio ad absurdum of a current environmental situation where we know we keep pumping the greenhouse gases into the environment, and we know that it's going to have catastrophic effects, yet we don't take any bold action to turn things around. So my fifth and final point about how the novel is a dystopia which critiques contemporary society. It's the idea that patrimony trumps merit, and that society is ideologically mystified in that way. In other words, people are led to believe in one thing where society actually practices another thing. The idea that patrimony trumps merit, I mean, that's the idea that inheritance is more important than the merit one earns, or how hard one works and all that. Thomas Piketty's book on economics, Capital in the 21st Century, really makes the point that capitalism in the 21st century has reached a stage where we can't really uphold this idea anymore that capitalism is synonymous with meritocracy, or the idea that one gets what one merits through work, but instead wealth has become something which is mainly inherited. In the novel, this is exactly the world that's portrayed. They're the two main characters, June and Day. They both are kind of prodigies. They both had a perfect score on the trial, which is like this dystopian standardized test. But they both had a perfect score. The difference being June was from a wealthy family, Day was from a poor family. So June got to enjoy all the privileges of wealth, while Day was basically experimented on like a lab rat and kind of left to die. So, at the same time, though, the society that's portrayed believes in the idea that, you score what you score on the trial, and then you get a station in life which befits your score. But as June finds out in the course of the novel, that's not true. And a part of the narrative is just June's coming to realize that this world she's brought up to believe in is disingenuous. So there are a lot of really complex ideas. I don't want to keep going on about that, but there are really a lot of complex ideas about ideology. But in any event, I think I'm going to end there. Very highly recommended. I mean, with all these issues that I've talked about, I mean, there's no end to the different ways you could teach the novel, and I would highly recommend it.